I was just looking on my phone to see what time it was back where I'm from in Philadelphia in the United States. It's about 4:45 a.m. and I was looking because I wanted to see if I could quickly say good morning to my kids, because they wake up and they check their phones when I'm away right before. Oh, they don't have school today, so never mind. They're going to wake up late, so it's going to be a long time. I was thinking about my kids. I'm always thinking about my kids when I'm here, because the reason I do what I do, the reason I do any of this, is because of my kids. They're the ones who really got me interested. And I'm really concerned about them. I mean, I'm really concerned about the world for my kids right now. I'm actually concerned. I get concerned for my kids sometimes when I'm at conferences like this, and I go to a lot of conferences like this, maybe all of them. And I'm often concerned, and I'm concerned because of the theme. Like, the theme of this conference is the world in 2030, and how do we prepare our kids for the world of 2030? And I'm like, no. I want to prepare the world for my kids in 2030, okay? Because I think that's really our job. Our job is to make sure the world is ready for the young people, right? And part of that, of course, is making sure the young people are ready. But when we get this mindset where we go, hey, what do we have to do to make sure the kids are ready? I feel like we have given way too much power to the machines, right? Way too much power to the computers. We're letting the computers dictate what we're going to teach our kids. We're letting the computers dictate what's the new childhood. I'm not really interested in that, although I'm a big tech guy. I'm not interested in letting the machines be in charge. We build the tools, they don't build us. And so what I want to talk about today is what I think kids need in order for them to help make the world that we want to see, right? Not to get them prepared to be the labor force for the computerized world of AI bots that are our overlords. And the main thesis here, the main point I'm going to make, is that what our kids really need is we need to make sure they know how to take all of the knowledge, all of the values, all the wisdom, all the old human knowledge, everything that we've known for thousands of years, and they need to know how to recontextualize that to make it meaningful in a different economic paradigm, in a different technological paradigm. And so that's what I'm going to talk about. And this is actually, it's not very cutting edge, because that is the reason school exists. That is the reason school has always existed. It's the reason we have always taught anything, is because we recognize that the world changes and that we need to make sure that we preserve some old things so that people can use them in new ways. Forget the narrative that you hear all the time about how we're living at a time of unprecedented change. I don't buy into this, okay? I sort of think that the future has always been uncertain. It's always been uncertain to everybody at every time. And when you look back historically, we go, oh my God, they didn't have as many changes as we have. But if you think back to what it must have been like for the people who came up with writing, for the people who came up with houses, for the people that came up with agriculture, they had all these incremental baby steps along the way where they thought, oh my God, this is crazy. How are we ever going to be prepared for the future? We're never going to be able to adapt to all of that. And I think we're just going through the same thing. When they look back at our time, when the archaeologists start to dig things up and look at our time, they're not going to remember punch card tabulators. They're not going to remember calculators. All they're going to do, in fact, they're probably not even going to remember computers or the fourth industrial revolution. It's all going to look like a little baby step on the way to the big change, right? And the big change might be quantum computing, might be bioengineering. My guess is we haven't even seen what the big change is. So that's number one. And I'll just point out that in ancient history, about 3,000 years ago, Heraclitus of Ephesus, who was one of the first philosophers pre-Socrates, he said the only constant is change. Right? So this conversation is the conversation that's been going on forever, and it's the conversation we have to ask. And it's how do we take knowledge? How do we take what matters? And how do we make sure that knowledge can be transitioned? I tend to think of it like a video game, okay? I kind of think of it, I like video games a lot. I used to talk a lot about video games. And I tend to think of it like a video game where sort of humanity is moving up from level, I don't know what level we're on. Maybe we're on level 4 or 5 or 6. We're moving up to level 7. We're leveling up, right? And our job as grown-ups is to say to the kids, let me tell you everything I learned about how to play in the last level, but I don't know how to play the next one. I'm hoping that if I give you, like, this is how you shoot a fireball, this is how you jump, this is how you run fast. My job is to tell you that, and now you have to figure out how to beat the level I didn't even get to play because I wasn't good enough, okay? So that's sort of what I imagine. And now compare that to the narrative we usually get, which is the narrative which tells us that you hear everywhere. You know, they started talking about 21st century skills in about 1970, okay? And it's been, you know, I did a whole survey of this recently, and you see a report every couple of years, a brand new one, and they're always changing, they're always fixing it, they're still doing it, even though we're like, almost 20% through, right, the 21st century. We're still trying to figure out what are the skills you need for the next century. And the constant that everyone comes up with is adaptability. And this makes no sense to me. This is a crazy, the question is, how do we prepare our kids to adapt to a changing world? And the answer is, adapt to a changing world, right? That's a tautology. That's self-referential. You're not allowed to answer a question with the word that's in the question. So I want to put that aside too. And I also want to say we have to do better than that. It's sort of a cop-out of grown-ups to say, hey, well, we don't know what's coming, so you know, we're just going to make sure you're prepared to figure it out, right? But no, it's our job. We know a whole lot of things. We know a whole lot of things as adults. We know a lot about how to be kind to each other. We know a lot about how to take care of each other. And we need to make sure we transfer that knowledge on, and we need to make sure that knowledge remains meaningful in a changing world. So the way we do that is we have to look at what the context is that we're asking young people to move into, okay? And by the way, we're not asking them, they're moving into it either way. And that's what I call the new childhood. They're moving into the new childhood. And I guess when I really think if I had to get to the essential idea about what's changing in the context of humanity, it's that it's becoming a connected world, okay? And it's a connected world not just in terms of technology. I mean, that's the obvious, simple way that it's connected. Yeah, I can talk to people all over the world, but it's also a connected world in terms of economy, right? Most trade now happens between countries that don't neighbor with each other, right? It's no longer those kinds of connections. It's a real connection from places that are far away. It's a connected world. I was just listening to Al Gore. It's a connected world in terms of the fact that we're all dealing with global challenges. It's no longer what's my local challenge I have to deal with. We have collected challenges. We have collective struggles as a species that we have to deal with. We're connected in that way too. We're absolutely connected in terms of infrastructure. I'm gonna by this time tomorrow, I don't know if it's this time tomorrow, but pretty close to this time tomorrow, I'll already be back at my home in Philadelphia, right? I mean, that's an unbelievable connection if you think about that. Every single one of our highways is a kind of connection. If you think about supply chains, the way supply chains work, this is a huge world of pathways and connections. And there's pros and cons to that, right? So the pros, of course, are when I think about my kids and I think about the fact that they have so much exposure to so many different people, right? They pick up, my kids play Minecraft and other video games all the time. I talk a lot about video games. They do it all the time. They do it with people all over the world, right? So my kids, I have 2 kids, they're 10 and 12, and they keep, on their laptop screens, they keep multiple time zones because they want to know. When is my friend in London going to wake up? When is my friend in Bosnia going to wake up because I want to play with them online? That's amazing. I barely knew where Bosnia was when I was their age. It was something I heard about on the news, right? They have friends that they talk to all the time, and that's pretty amazing. Their online life, that exposure is really, really, really fantastic. And then of course there are some really, really hard negatives that have come from that connection, as we've seen politically going on in all over the world. And I want to talk a bit about that because my thinking is you really need to see the border walls and the Brexits, right? You really need to see these things as a desire to close off connections, as a desire to close off pathways, as a fear of the connected world, right? You have to understand it as sort of a physical manifestation of our psychological anxiety on some level. They're really about closing that pathway, sealing sealing the pores between things, because people don't want them to move. And the reason they don't want them to move is because we haven't taught anyone how to deal with a world that's this connected yet, right? So often you hear people with this sort of romantic idea that if we just expose people to different people, it's going to be fantastic. They're going to automatically become empathetic and altruistic. I wish that were the case. But it's not, and that's not the case because I don't want you to hear me saying that's not the case because it's human nature to not like things that, I think it's actually nicer than that. Exposure to diversity, it's a great thing. I think you should have it, but we need to teach people how to deal with it. And the reason you have to teach people how to deal with it, when I say that you have to teach people how to deal with it, if you want to get to the empathy and altruism, you have to teach people how to have exposure in a way that doesn't threaten their sense of self. Okay? Think about this for a second. When the way that you know who you are is partially by knowing what you're not, right? So there always has to be an other in order for you to have an identity, right? And it doesn't have to be an other in the sense of, the other people that I hate. It can just be other things like air is not part of me, right? Right? The floor is not part of me. I need to know where I end and where what's not me begins. But when we're suddenly all exposed to so many different voices that we can't figure out how to make sense of that meaningfully, I'm not at all surprised that we have a world right now with a terrifying amount of xenophobia, right? With this terrifying amount of tribalism. Again, I see this very much as people who are suddenly exposed to too much where nobody ever said, listen, here's what you do when you see things that aren't familiar. Here's how you make sense of it. Here's how you can feel meaningful. Here's how you can feel valuable. Here's how you can feel confident about yourself while being exposed to so many other things. We haven't taught that. Right? And to me, that's the question. If I have to answer the question, what do our kids need to be prepared for 2030, which I already told you I don't want to answer, but if I had to answer it, I would say that's not a question of labor. That's not a question of what do they need to participate in a world of AI. That's not a question of what do they need to deal with the world of automation. That's not a question of do they need STEM skills. That's not a question of do they need flexibility or creativity. It's not even a question of do they need empathy. It's a question of how do you make sure that people can have a meaningful sense of self in a connected world? How do you teach them to make sense of themselves in a world like that? We don't know how to do that because the majority of the sense of self that's been shared all over the world is a Euro-American individualistic sense of self, has been this sort of, hey, this is what we're going to promote everywhere. And that one says, close off, right? That one says, imagine yourself as a repository with a fence around your house. Right? So that's not going to work. There needs to be a much different sense of how do you find meaning in that. And so I'm only going to talk a bit more before I open it up to some questions. But I want to say that what you do and what has to happen in school for this to happen is we have to start reevaluating all of the structures of the classroom which have been designed in order to give people a meaningful sense of self in a very different kind of world, right? They've been designed to make you feel a certain way. And so what's happening right now is this anxiety where all of the messaging in school is going, you want to feel a meaningful sense of self, it only works in an enclosure. It only works in an individualistic world. It only works in a closed off way where you accumulate more for yourself, where you think about how do you compete, where you think about how do I get a job that allows me to compete in the world. That's what we do with grades, right? That's what grades are. They're the sort of tokens, the awards we give you for proving that you can accumulate the most skills for yourself. We need to start to reimagine activities that in their very structure are already connected in their thinking, are already saying, how do you take the tools? And by the way, that's why I'm saying nothing's changing. We've been talking about math for 3,000 years, right? We've been talking about almost all of the main academic skills for 3,000 years. Yeah, they've changed. We've iterated them here and there. They're all still necessary. The problem is, how do you use them in connected ways rather than in individualistic ways? And there's times throughout history where it has been used in different ways, right? We sort of have this fantasy that it's always been the same way, but you just look at it. Every time there's a new economic and technological paradigm throughout history, there's a sort of shift in how we're going to take the ancient wisdom, right, and make it meaningful in that new context, in that new situation. I'm looking at the time. They told me I was supposed to talk for 15 minutes and take questions for 15 minutes. So I want to stop and not say too much. The same thing I do when I'm teaching in the classroom, which is I talk too much, and then I go, no, wait, I'm not supposed to talk. You're supposed to talk, right? And then we have a conversation. So let's just move to questions and see where that goes. That's also way more in alignment with a connected way of thinking than me sitting up here talking at you. Questions? There's one over here and one over here. I don't know.
Since you're a gamer, into gaming.
Yeah. Wait. What's your name? Where are you from?
Sorry, Saima Ismail. I work for Aman Foundation in Pakistan.
Yeah. I'm pleased to meet you.
Pleased to meet you too. I wanted to understand if there is any games or any sort of particular type of gaming which can help children learn empathy.
Yes, there's tons of it, and there's a lot of research around it. I actually just did a guide that's digital play for global citizenship that talks a lot about it. There's so many things that you need to consider in doing that. The question is, if your goal is to say, how do you build a strong sense of self that you can articulate in a connected way, there's tons of games to do that. That might mean the creative projects through digital play, right? This may mean a kind of creative media development. That's already a step towards building empathy. I know we often don't think of that because where are the other people if I'm expressing myself? But when you're expressing yourself, there's by definition other people, because I'm not expressing myself to the air. Right? I'm thinking about how do I interact with others, and that's a really key part of empathy and skill and is self-articulation. If the goal is just understanding, tons of tools. There's some here. There were some great VR things. I'm sure you saw in there that just expose you to other things. But again, exposure without help. Right? A game itself is not going to do it. I will tell you, most studies of video games have already, the online multiplayer connected games have already found that there's sort of a natural empathy that's built more. I'm not quite sure I buy all the studies, but what I will tell you that I do buy, and it's clear, is that people form their relationships, and they form their sort of in-game cliques according to very different things than what we do in the real world, right? In the real world, we tend to do it around religion, we tend to do it around race, we tend to do it around gender, we tend to do it around socioeconomic class. You don't do that in a game. You go, who's going to be the best at playing the game with me? So they're already starting to see people building things that then open the pathway to empathy. But is there going to be a game that builds it? No, game might be a tool that humans can use to build it. We have to get out of this mindset that the games do things to us. If the games do things to us, it's the people who design the games that are doing things to us. It's not the games. Yeah. So, yeah. There was another question on this side. Yeah. 2 more questions. 3 more questions.
Hi, thank you for the insightful introduction. My name is Lama Andari, and I'm a consultant. I'm also a co-founder of an NGO and dedicate to disadvantaged youth in Lebanon. You're concerned,
you.
Likewise, you're concerned about your kids. I'm concerned about my future kids.
Yeah. I'm concerned about your future kids too.
I live in Dubai, and as you know, 80% of us are foreigners. And my one of the themes that I always think about is how can we create community cohesion amongst different nationalities? How can we instill values in our children that they should respect one another and they should not feel this anxiety towards the future like adults feel, because we're transmitting it, whether deliberately or not, to our children. Are you aware, or do you advise about certain activities that we can create that are not necessarily technologically driven, that create and stimulate interactions amongst youth to create this sense of, one community, despite different backgrounds?
Yeah. Well, let me say two things here, and I'll probably forget between them two, so you might have to remind me. The first thing I want to say, because you said not necessarily with technology, and that's fine. I can think of things without technology, but there's a real argument to be made that I would make that we should be using the technology in order to build those tools, because that's part of what connects us, right? So you need to be able to use the tools of the times. Part of what we mean when I say take the old wisdom and contextualize it in a new world means teach people how to use the tools of this world in order to do it, right? My goal is not to teach them technology. I'm not at all worried about kids learning technology, right? I'm barely worried about kids learning tools. I mean, we're living there's more, as we've heard many times, more migration right now than ever before in human history. When immigrants arrive somewhere, they learn new skills real fast. Humans have no trouble learning new skills. We struggle to figure out how to maintain our sense of self when there's change happening around us. We don't struggle to figure out how to stay busy and survive, right? We're pretty good at that. We're pretty resourceful. Your question was, what can you do in Dubai or just in classrooms in general? I think the first thing is thinking about restructuring the everyday habitual thinking about school. Everything we do in school is about individual achievement, right? Even group projects, then we grade you on individual achievement. We need to build grades that are based on how well did you work with everybody else, right? I don't care if you learned your math, right? I care whether or not you learned how to use math to talk to your friend, right? And if you start to do those kinds of things, that will change that mindset. These are sort of deep psychological mindset shifts that need to happen. We're actively teaching kids to divide, right? We've built structures that, whether we mean to or not, are implicitly saying, don't be friends with them, try to beat them, try to compete with them, right? Your goal is to be the best in the class and everybody else is an obstacle, right? That's the lesson, that's what kids learn. Kids don't, when I tell my kids don't eat candy in your room, they go, yes, Dad, and then they figure out how to get the candy into their room because they see that Dad sometimes eats his candy in the room. So therefore, they don't believe it. So that's what we tell our kids. We say, share, be kind, be good, and then they look around and they go, right, but you're also telling us compete. Don't see everyone as an obstacle to you getting ahead in the world. And then they turn on the TV and they see politicians and sports and sportscasters and coaches and players being celebrated for being jerks and being bullies all day long. And we give the most rewards as a global society to the biggest jerks, right? Well, what is a kid going to learn? They don't pay attention to our words. They pay attention to what they see happening around them. They learn, I have to do what you say while I'm little, but once I get to be an adult, I do what you do. Right. So there were another hand over here in the back here, back corner here.
Yeah, hi, thanks.
What's your name?
Sorry, my name is Jay, and
Hi, Jay.
I'm also a teacher here in Dubai, working with GEMS. And the question I've got is, I'm a huge fan of gaming, game-based learning. I have a son also playing online, and my question is more about actually how we enhance that use of technology, because I do believe that that exponential rise of technology is gonna make our schools a wonderful place. I think there's some things to be scared of, but also a lot of positives. And so I guess my question is that we don't need to teach the students necessarily how to use it.
Yeah.
They know how to do that, I understand, but how do we get that into schools where teachers feel comfortable allowing that to take place, where you've talked about the barriers that we do need to give grades, we do need to pass exams, but actually, with this technology, we can solve some of those grand challenges. But your thoughts on really how do we go about that fundamental change, possibly top down, in terms of making sure that we're embracing that and making sure it is happening?
Yeah. Well, I think I'm gonna answer this. I don't know what the right word is to describe it, but I'm going to say, I would say the real challenge there, I mean, I've been looking at this all over the world. I'm big game-based learning, big fan of it, but we haven't changed what we want to teach, okay? And until we change what we want, that's the obstacle. The obstacle is not getting technology in. What do you need technology for if we're just teaching the same things with the technology, right? I mean, yeah, listen, there was no internet when I was a kid. I got a fantastic education. I'm with the people who go, what do you need a computer to teach reading for? You don't need a computer to teach reading. You just need resources. I went to probably one of the best schools in the world, right? The only issue in terms of teaching reading is socioeconomic injustice, right? Is that rich people get really good reading teachers, right? But we know how to do it. We know exactly how to teach reading, and we don't need a computer to help us teach reading. We do need a computer to help us teach how to think in a connected way. And until we make that shift to where we want to teach people how to think in a connected way, you're going to get tons of resistance to computers. You know, the question is not a how. The question is still a what. The question is still what do we want to teach? So it's not quite a direct answer to your question, except for to say, as long as we're still fighting about how to get the best PISA score, right? We're not going to adopt the technology across the way, or the way it's going to get adopted is which corporation has the biggest muscle to get it into the most districts, right? Because it's going to be purely a profit game. But if our goal is to actually teach the things that you can only learn through these technologies, and then we agree that you need to learn them, then we will adopt them, right? We adopted pencils real quick, right? Because they made sense for what we wanted to learn, right? The chalk slates didn't work that well, right? For the kinds of writing we wanted people to have. But I haven't seen a real change in learning objectives yet that's going to get us to the point where the computers make sense. And that's why you hear the response of people going, what do you mean, you want robot teachers? Right? Because that's what it looks like. Well, you're just trying to make it more efficient to teach reading. It's not that inefficient, right? It's unequally distributed, but it's not inefficient, right? And those aren't the same thing. Lucy had a question. I have to ask your name, but I know your name.
So I'm Lucy from Camfed. So Jordan, I was really interested in how you started off talking about the importance of young people really building their own sense of identity and building their own narrative.
Yeah.
And I'm interested to hear your thoughts, and I think you might have partly answered that in response to a previous question, but around the interface with the collective identity and the collective narrative. Because I do think under something like what we saw with Brexit, is that there wasn't a collective narrative. There was tribalism, but there wasn't a collective narrative that was enough to buffer the sort of siren call of Brexit, or in the case of Trump. And so I'm interested in how you see that interface between building your own sense of identity, building your own narrative, and how you then interface that and build a collective narrative.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would separate them, honestly. I mean, I think we could have a real discussion about whether they need to be separated or not. At least for argument's sake right now, I think I would say, if I were to think about Brexit, so much of how we've learned to think about ourselves has been through nationalistic or tribalistic mindsets, right? Or gender mindsets or religious mindsets, right? That's how we construct our individual self also. So in the lack of ability to construct an individual self, you're grasping onto the easiest collective self that you can do, because it's the only thing we've taught kids how to make, and adults, right? How to make sense of themselves is only through those kinds of models. And there's nothing bad about those. There's something bad about tribalism if it leads to factionalism, right? But there's nothing bad about identifying yourself culturally or religiously. But if that's only through hate, it just doesn't work in a connected world, right? It did work once. I'm sad that it worked once, but the world once worked that way, right? When that was actually a useful skill of the self at one point in a very different world. there are people who would like to see that world go back to that. I mean, that's not going to happen. It's too late, right? The doors are already open. There's doors already connecting us. Now we got to figure out how to live in it. It doesn't quite answer your question, except for to say I don't agree with the question, right? Over here and then over here. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Cesar.
Cesar. From where?
From Venezuela.
Oh, pleased to meet you.
Thank you. Going
you
back
have to be last. I'm sorry.
Sorry. Okay. Going back to your comment about the what instead of the how.
Yeah.
And I kind of agree with it because when I grew up, there was, I think, an excessive focus on the STEMs. Coming from an oil-producing country, everybody you have to be an engineer.
Yeah.
And my mind was full with useless thing like trigonometry, which I've never used in my life. And I spent endless amount of hours calculating trigonometry and stuff like that. If I was going to become an engineer, and I don't think even engineers use trigonometry anymore. But my point is, when I've been successful in life, it's when I was able to combine skills, the ones that I really use with empathy and emotional intelligence and all that. And I call it a little bit like the what's on, what's off effect from Karate Kid, no? Because you don't see it first, but then eventually you put it together and boom, then you become successful.
I think that's true now, but I think especially when you get to the question of STEM, or I'll just use math for a second here, I have a good friend. He teaches at Stanford. He's a very, very well-known, very award-winning mathematician. He says almost everything he learned in his graduate degree in math is obsolete now. Okay, he said it's all done by Wolfram Alpha, Google, and Excel spreadsheets. He said it used to be. When you were, I'm guessing when you were, well, we'd still left over. It used to be that you needed to be, everyone needed to be a mathematician meant to execute certain processes, right? And that's why you had people in the basement of engineering firms whose job it was to just execute that math, right? And to be able to do it. We don't need to do that anymore, but we do need to understand it. You use your trigonometry all the time. You don't actually ever do the trigonometry calculations, but the fact that you learned how to think in terms of trigonometry became useful. We need to, technologically, we need to start thinking about a world in which we don't need to do a lot of those things anymore, and we need to figure out how to connect the problems with the tools. It's another kind of connection. That's the real skill, is the skill of connecting the problem with the tools, right? My kids don't need to be able to do perfect square roots, okay? I don't care if they get them right, but they better understand how doing a square root works, because they need to understand it so that they know what to ask the computer to do for them. Right, and that means we might drill and have them do it over and over again. My hope is we figure out a better way to teach some of these things, and my hope is that the computers help us teach some of those things in a better way. But I think that's sort of part of what you're getting at. You used to have to be a machine that could do things and a repository of information. Now the repository is in the cloud and the calculations are in the cloud, and all we have to do is we have to be able to pick the right processes and the right protocols to do things. We're out of time, and they're going to start yelling at me because they're really serious about time. At least in this room, I know not in the big ballroom, but in this room, they're very serious about time. So thank you all very much.